Encourage the people in the virtual audience to type in their comments and questions in the Zoom chat. The library will email our guest speaker the text of the Zoom chat afterwards, so please include anything you'd love her to read. On this eve of International Women's Day, we're delighted to be hosting Elaine Bander for a talk on reading Jane Austen. Elaine Bander is a knowledgeable and passionate champion of Jane Austen. She has done extensive research, writing, and speaking about Jane Austen and served in leadership positions with the Jane Austen Society of North America. She is a past president of JASNA Canada and past regional coordinator for JASNA Quebec. Elaine taught literature at Dawson College for many years, up to her retirement from the Dawson English Department in 2009. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Bander.
Thank you. Yeah, it's on. Miss Bates, who's a kind of holy fool character in Jane Austen's Emma, says, "It is such a happiness when good people get together," and they always do. And I think that's a good description of the lunchtime series here in the Atwater Library. Good people getting together, and they always do. So thank you very much for inviting me and letting me speak to you about my favorite topic. Before I start, I want to tell you there's a flyer available on the back table. One tells you something about the Jane Austen Society of North America, and it lets you know about a program we're doing here in the Adair Auditorium, open to the public, totally free, on May 4th. That's a Saturday at 1:30, called Austen on the Rocks. And two JASNA members from Vancouver, one of whom is a geologist, are going to be talking to us about the relationship between Jane Austen's works and the female fossilists of the time. You've probably heard of Mary Anning, but there were more, and so we can learn about them on May 4th. Please, if you're interested, pick up the flyer, and there's a membership form on the back. So I know not everyone here today or online today will have read Jane Austen, so I'll try to avoid spoilers, but you've probably all seen a film or two. Yeah. When Jane Austen died in 1817, she was just beginning to be recognized by discriminating readers as a fine novelist, but very few of her growing number of admirers even knew her name, because the 4 novels that she published in her lifetime all appeared anonymously. They were written by a lady, and she was a lady. She was a country parson's daughter, belonging to what we now call the pseudo-gentry of clergy families, who were admitted to gentry society even though they didn't own estates. Ladies did not usually become published authors, but from childhood, Jane Austen admired 3 slightly older, very famous, and highly praised female novelists. Ladies all. They were Frances Burney, Charlotte Smith, and Maria Edgeworth. Unlike these successful female novelists, Jane Austen's name never appeared on her books, nor was she able to hang out with all those wonderful artists, writers, and intellectuals of London's brilliant emerging meritocracy at the time, as the other ladies did. She certainly sought recognition, publication, and money. She badly needed the money. She was poor all her life. But she didn't want personal fame. In fact, she feared that being known to be a novelist would jeopardize her social standing with her neighbors. They would be afraid to speak in her presence at tea parties or dances or dinners, because she might put something nasty about them in a book. So when Jane Austen died all too young at 41, she was mourned not as a great writer, but as a beloved child, sister, aunt, and friend. And that's how you'll find her memorialized in Winchester Cathedral. But today, on the eve of International Women's Day, we can honor her memory and her work, and we should remember that she had complete faith in her own genius, and that she always kept that faith. We can also ask, how did she do it? She never went to university, never belonged to a writers group, never met other writers in cafes and bars, never went to readings or book launches, never had a blog or a YouTube channel. She couldn't even contact her publishers directly. Her father and then her brother did that for her. She did own a handsome Broadwood forte piano on which she practiced every morning, but she had no internet, no computer, not even a fountain pen. She wrote every word of every draft of her novels using a pencil or a dip pen by daylight, candlelight, or oil lamp. And if you haven't tried it, I suggest you do, because it's not easy. Despite Virginia Woolf's famous dictum that a woman writer needs 100 pounds a year in a room of her own, Jane Austen never had a room of her own, and certainly she never had 100 pounds a year to spend on herself. Until her death, she shared a bedroom and a bed with her beloved older sister Cassandra, who was named after their mother. And when her father died in 1805, just after her 29th birthday, Jane and her sister and their mother were very poor indeed, living in cramped, rented lodgings in Bath and Southampton, until her rich brother Edward offered the three women a comfortable cottage in the village of Chawton near Jane Austen's childhood home in Hampshire. They moved there in 1809, creating a household of women, along with Jane's childhood friend Martha Lloyd, also a spinster. Immediately following that move, Jane began seriously to seek publication of the three novels that she had written and been revising regularly since her teens. It helped that her family were supportive of her writing career. Her father and later her older brother Henry acted as her agent, and the family didn't expect too many chores from her when she was busy writing, but she still lived the life of a genteel spinster daughter in late Georgian England. Even at Chawton, she never had a private room or even a desk of her own, only a small portable wooden box with a hinged lid called a writing desk, in which she stored her writing materials. Her last three novels were written on slips of paper while she sat at a tiny table in the small common living room of Chawton Cottage. The squeaky door to the room was never oiled so that Jane could be warned of approaching visitors and could hide her slips of paper under a blotter before anyone caught her in the unladylike act of writing Mansfield Park or Emma. If Jane Austen were to come back today, surely she'd be gratified by her fame, by her literary reputation, but she might also be astonished to see how her books and her life have been appropriated by popular culture. She has become an iconic, almost cultic figure, recognizable even to those who've never read her novels. Her image is displayed, exploited, or spoofed almost as often as Leonardo's Mona Lisa or Shakespeare's portrait, used to sell not only books, magazines, and films, but also mugs, t-shirts, socks. Oh, you can't see, but I'm wearing my Pride and Prejudice socks. Yeah. Even action figures. Most of her works have been adapted to film. She's the subject of biopics, blogs, documentaries, websites, fan clubs, and annual festivals, as well as academic conferences. Although her books contain only one character of color, and that character is only talked about, she doesn't actually appear, her novels have been reimagined in new formats and in new contexts, situated in many cultures very far from the genteel, all-white society that Austen inhabited. And all of this is wonderful. I love the Bollywood Bride and Prejudice. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's wonderful. joyful. And while I haven't seen the new Hallmark movie version of Sense and Sensibility with an African heritage Dashwood family, my Austen-related social media feed is all abuzz with its delights, so I guess that's worth watching too. On the other hand, I have seen Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies twice. Jane would love it. Today, then, her novels are frequently quoted, misquoted, or alluded to, even by people who've never read them. It's become, I find, an annoying tick of popular journalism to begin an article with the opening words of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged, ... And one could say of Jane Austen, as Henry Crawford says in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, speaking of Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare is a part of an Englishman's constitution. His thoughts and beauties are so spread abroad that one touches them everywhere. One is intimate with him by instinct. This kind of intimacy by instinct, however, can lead to some serious misconceptions. All too often, Austen's thought of as a writer of romantic love stories set in a gentler world, a pleasant escape for harried modern readers. But there's more to Austen than elegant Regency decor, fragile porcelain teacups, and happily ever after romance, more than Keira Knightley and Colin Firth. In fact, her novels, 6 of the best ever written, offer careful readers not so much an escape into a prettier, tidier landscape of soft green hills and floaty dresses with sunshine and servants and romantic endings, but rather a strategy for understanding and negotiating our own complex society. After 200 years, Austen still challenges readers of her novels to know themselves. And that, my friends, is why we should keep reading her. So, how did she do it? How did this provincial girl from a country parsonage turn herself into a thoroughly professional writer, a writer whom critics were already comparing to Shakespeare just a few years after her death? Her writing career began in childhood within her immediate family, all of them keen readers and witty writers, and it developed within the intimate network of other keen readers and writers, her extended family and close friends. She was born at the end of 1775, the 6th of 8 children, the second daughter of the Reverend George Austen, a clever country parson of modest social background, and his wife Cassandra Lee, herself a parson's daughter, but the granddaughter of the Duke, so kind of hanging on to the bottom of the aristocracy. They didn't have much money, but they were an intelligent, even intellectual, but still lively, happy family. And in defiance of the snobbish pretense that novels were not worth reading, they all cheerfully and unashamedly indulged their enthusiasm for novels. Good ones, silly ones, preachy ones, scary ones, it didn't much matter. Since novels were scarce and expensive, usually rented from a local lending library or a neighborhood book society, the good ones were reread many times. In late Georgian England, dinner for ordinary folk like the Austens would be taken in daylight around 4 p.m. to save candles, which were expensive, so the evenings were long. While the ladies sat at their needlework around the fire after dinner, often one person would read aloud from a novel until it was time to eat a light supper and then go to bed. The family home was, in effect, a book club. Reading was thus both a private and a public act for Austen. Her letters describe these family readings along with her critical commentary on the books they read. For as she matured, she read novels not simply for entertainment, but also with a critical professional eye on the competition. In January 1807, for instance, she tells her sister, Alphonsine did not do. Now, Alphonsine was the title of a new novel by French author Madame de Genlis. We were disgusted in 20 pages as, independent of a bad translation, it has indelicacies which disgrace a pen hitherto so pure, and we changed it for the female quixote, which now makes our evening amusement, to me a very high one, as I find the work quite equal to what I remembered it. She's referring to Charlotte Lennox's 1752 novel, The Female Quixote. It was already about 60 years old and obviously very familiar to the Austen ladies. Even so, they clearly enjoyed another rereading of this story about a motherless young girl who reads too many archaic romances and begins to fancy herself the heroine of just such a romance. And I should add that Jane Austen was no prude. There are a lot of sexual jokes in her private correspondence. I particularly love a passage she wrote to Cassandra about their plans for moving to Bath in 1801 after her father had retired from the ministry. My mother looks forward with as much certainty as you can do to our keeping 2 maids. My father is the only one not in the secret. We plan on having a steady cook and a giddy housemaid with a sedate middle-aged man who is to undertake the double office of husband to the former and sweetheart to the latter. No children, of course, to be allowed on either side. So a month after deploring the indelicacies of Alphonsine, Jane reports to Cassandra, we are reading Clarentine, and that's a 1798 novel by Sarah Harriet Burney, who was Fanny Burney's much younger half-sister, and are surprised to find how foolish it is. I remember liking it much less on a second reading than at the first, and it does not bear a third at all. It is full of unnatural conduct and forced difficulties without striking merit of any kind. Ouch. Yeah, clearly in the Austen household, novels were read and reread and read again to be discussed and evaluated for realism, language, and morality. The Austens also read plays together, mostly Shakespeare, but also more contemporary works. Over a couple of Christmas holidays in Jane's childhood, her talented older brothers, home from school or from Oxford, along with some lively visiting cousins, staged plays in the family barn. Throughout her life, whenever Jane visited relatives or friends in London or Bath or elsewhere, she attended as many plays as possible. She loved the theater, and from playwrights like Sheridan, she learned to write witty dialogue. All of the Austen family wrote witty doggerel poems and pieces spoofing popular literature. Her 2 older brothers published a weekly satirical paper called The Loiterer while they were at Oxford, while they were students. It was modeled on The Spectator, and some scholars suspect that Jane had a hand in writing 1 or 2 of the entries. And by the way, an Austen family copy of The Loiterer, the bound edition, is just down the road at McGill in the Rare Books room. Jane was certainly encouraged to invent her own amusing parodies of real books, novels, histories, plays, travel memoirs, conduct books providing moral advice and etiquette for young ladies for the enjoyment of her family and friends. Her father gave her some ready-made bound notebooks into which she copied her teenage writings, complete with title pages and mock serious dedication to family and friends. Writing these burlesques meant that young Jane had to analyze the conventional elements of other people's writing in order to exaggerate them and thus satirize them. It's hard to convey their character with just a snippet, but here are the 4 opening short paragraphs of Austen's teenage mock novel, Henry and Eliza. Listen to her deployment of cliché, pretentious phrases and plot devices so bland and familiar, punctuated here and there by an unexpected, outrageous detail. So it begins. As Sir George and Lady Harcourt were superintending the labors of their haymakers, rewarding the industry of some by smiles of approbations, and punishing the idleness of others by a cudgel, they perceived lying closely concealed beneath the thick foliage of a haycock a beautiful little girl not more than 3 months old. Touched by the enchanting graces of her face and delighted with the infantine, though sprightly answers she returned to their many questions, 3-month-old child, they resolved to take her home and, having no children of their own, to educate her with care and cost. Being good people themselves, their first and principal care was to incite in her a love of virtue and a hatred of vice, in which they so well succeeded, Eliza having a natural turn that way herself, that when she grew up, she was the delight of all who knew her. Beloved by Lady Harcourt, adored by Sir George, and admired by all the world, she lived in a continual course of uninterrupted happiness till she had attained her 18th year, when, happening one day to be detected in stealing a banknote of £50, she was turned out of doors by her inhumane benefactors. Everything's so predictable and bland until the virtuous Eliza stealing a banknote, which makes nonsense of the whole. These early reading and writing experiences of Jane Austen taught her to relate to her readers as equals. They shared a common experience of the same books, but they also shared responsibility for the construction of meaning. For in any parody, burlesque, or satire, the joke is always an inside joke, depending on the audience's knowledge of the thing being satirized, as well as their ability to decode the ironic tone of the writer. So her sense of audience was further forged by the many letters she wrote, especially to her sister. Whenever they were apart during their frequent visits to friends and relations, Jane and Cassandra would write to one another 3 times a week. Today, of course, they'd be emailing or messaging or FaceTiming. The letters reveal a writer who trusts her reader to follow her change of voice as she elides into irony or into the voice of a character whose views might not be her own, a practice that helped her to develop her characteristic and unmistakable narrative voice in her novels. Her letters show her to be a confident, fluent writer who uses shared reading experience as a source of casual allusion, a kind of shorthand, so she could refer to a character or a situation in a novel to let Cassandra know what she was experiencing. For example, in 1796, when the Austens would all have been reading Fanny Burney's newly published 3rd novel, Camilla, 20-year-old Jane writes to tell her sister that she will not be able to leave London as planned because her brother is not around to escort her home. A woman cannot travel on her own unescorted. She explains her predicament by referring to a scene in Camilla in which the young heroine's brother Lionel leaves Camilla and her friends stuck on a high wooden platform when he removes the access ladder. Jane writes, "Tomorrow I shall be just like Camilla in Mr. Dubster's summer house, for my Lionel will have taken away the ladder by which I came here, or at least by which I intended to get away, and here I must stay till his return. My situation, however, is somewhat preferable to hers, for I am very happy here." These rhetorical strategies of elusiveness and irony that she developed in childhood shift interpretive responsibility from author to reader, and Austen always trusts her readers. Her genius as a writer, then, grew out of her temperament as a reader who both enjoyed and burlesqued the conventions and occasional sillinesses of other writers. In engaging her own readers, she presumes familiarity with those sometimes silly conventions, plots, and characters, even as she thwarts our expectations that her novels, too, will follow those conventions. Today, of course, few of us know the novels that Jane Austen and her friends read, so let me tell you something about them. In the genre of later 18th century novels that we now label sentimental or marriage plot or courtship novels, just about every heroine is nobly born, even if at first she appears to be poor or illegitimate, found 3 months old in a haycock. She is also strikingly beautiful. When she enters a ballroom, men flock to her side and call her an angel. In the course of the novel, at least one of them attempts to abduct her for forcible marriage, seduction, or rape. The heroine is both exceptionally talented, usually by nature rather than nurture. She just knows how to do all these things, and impressively virtuous and self-sacrificing. Her lover and eventual husband, who repeatedly saves her from disaster, death, or undeserved disgrace, is handsome, dashing, noble, rich, and as virtuous as herself. None of the heroine's many tribulations are her own fault, and her ultimate restoration to health, wealth, and marriage is her reward for suffering throughout a convoluted plot with many digressions. Readers open to new novel expecting variations on this paradigm. The problem is, all too many of Jane Austen's first readers among her friends and acquaintances, just like many film adapters today, want to put the cliches back in. For fun, while she lay dying in 1817, Austen wrote a hilarious plan of a novel based on all the suggestions she had received from friends and from friends of friends, as well as the examples provided in the novels that she herself had read. So this is her plan of a novel, and she's dying when she writes this. Heroine of faultless character, herself perfectly good, with much tenderness and sentiment, and not the least wit. Very highly accomplished, understanding modern languages, and generally speaking, everything that the most accomplished young women learn, playing equally well on the pianoforte and harp, and singing in the first style. The story will proceed and contain a striking variety of adventures. Heroine and her father never above a fortnight together in one place, he being driven from his curacy by the vile arts of some totally unprincipled and heartless young man, desperately in love with the heroine, pursuing her with unrelenting passion. Early in her career, heroine must meet with the hero, all perfection, of course, and only prevented from paying his addresses to her by some excess of refinement. At the same time that she was writing this mock plan of a novel, Austen also commented on the character in a novel that her teenage niece Anna was writing. Aunt Jane complains, "I wish you would not let this character plunge into a vortex of dissipation. I do not object to the thing, but I cannot bear the expression. It is such thorough novel slang, so old that I dare say Adam met with it in the first novel he opened." Aunt Jane avoided all such novel slang in her own writing, unless she put it into the mouth of a character or infused it with irony. As a girl then, Jane Austen spoofed novel conventions by exaggerating them in playful stories and plays that she wrote for her family and friends. But as she became a professional writer, she scaled down these conventional plots and characters until they were woven seamlessly into the circumstantial fabric of ordinary life beyond the boundaries of fiction. When Austen does invoke novel cliches or novel slang, as she just called it, it's only to tease us into assuming that we know what's going to happen. She then undermines our assumptions. In Austen's novel, the sexiest guy in the room isn't always destined to marry the heroine. In fact, he usually turns out to be a cad or maybe just a not very responsible young man. Austen's heroines tend to value less flashy but more reliable heroes. The cliche novel heroine's carriage abduction, as it's called, when the villain abducts her in a carriage, becomes nothing much worse than being cornered by a bore or lied to by a fool, or in Austen's fourth novel, Emma, being proposed to by a slightly tipsy, conceited young man while confined with him in a carriage. The dangers faced by Austen's heroines are not so much external threats from seducers and swindlers, but rather internal perils, moral or spiritual dangers that every young woman must negotiate on her way to a fully realized selfhood. And careful readers of her novels share these same potential perils. We too must negotiate choices in our readerly responses to her characters and plots. Like Austen's heroines, we too must learn to see accurately, judge fairly, and choose wisely. Not surprisingly, most people today know Austen, if at all, through Pride and Prejudice, the third novel that she published early in. No, that's not true. It's the second novel that she published, the third that she wrote, in 1813. And I suspect that even more people have heard of Austen only because of film and video adaptations, again, mostly of Pride and Prejudice, and they're lovely and fun, but they do tend to re-inject those romantic cliches that Austen so carefully excises from her plots. And most of all, they lack the unique narrative voice of Austen's novels. Pride and Prejudice, in fact, is an outlier among her novels. It's the only one in which the heroine detests the hero for the first half of the novel, and it's the only one of her 6 novels in which a relatively poor heroine marries Prince Charming, or rather, as he's first presented, Prince Not So Charming. In most of Austen's novels, the heroine marries a modest professional man, like a clergyman or a naval officer. In one novel, she marries the man next door, a landowning gentleman to be sure, but not at all rich or snobbish. And in Pride and Prejudice, all the good people are likable or lovable, while all the bad people we can happily reject without any qualms or regrets. No one is seriously harmed in the course of the novel. So Pride and Prejudice is an easy novel to love, as Jane Austen herself acknowledged when she received her first copy from the publisher. "I have got my own darling child from London," she wrote to her sister in 1813, and then describes how she and her mother began reading the novel aloud to an unsuspecting visitor who had no idea that Jane was the author. She was amused, poor soul, that she could not help, with 2 such people, Jane and her mother, to lead the way, but she really does seem to admire Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine. "I must confess that I think her as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least, I do not know." But even as Austen was writing this letter to Cassandra, she was about halfway through composing her 4th novel, Mansfield Park. It was her first mature novel that she wrote all of a piece, not over time in childhood, while she was settled comfortably in Chawton. In some ways, it's an anti-Pride and Prejudice. In Mansfield Park, the charming, witty characters who attract us as they attract their fellow characters prove dangerous, while the good, worthy characters are less obviously engaging. These include, above all, the young heroine Fanny Price, a shy, anxious girl, a Cinderella figure, the poor relation in a wealthy house filled with her noisy, robust cousins. Fanny couldn't be more different from Lizzie Bennet. She's silent, observant, compliant, bookish, physically frail, diffident, without much sense of humor. She's also morally serious, continually reflecting upon her own judgment and behavior, and she's the only character in this novel who does so. She tries earnestly to do the right thing rather than the comfortable thing, and she frequently doubts her own judgment, but her seriousness and serious reflection give her the courage to do the right thing, even when everyone around her expects her to do the wrong thing. For over 200 years, readers of Mansfield Park have found it difficult to like Fanny Price. Some literary critics have seen this as a flaw, but I think it's actually a feature. Austen knew exactly what she was doing. Here she seems to be saying, "I made it easy for you to choose the right outcome in Pride and Prejudice. It's a bit more complicated in Mansfield Park." A central scene in Mansfield Park has all of the young people wandering in a wilderness. That was a landscape feature planted with trees, provided with paths so ladies and gentlemen could walk sheltered from the sun. Each of the characters responds differently, characteristically, to this wilderness. Will they try to pass through the locked gate? Will they deviate from the first great path onto the serpentine walk? In a sense, Mansfield Park presents the same challenges to readers. Henry Crawford, rich, charming, and clever, appears at first to be the perfect suitor for Fanny Price, the undervalued niece of Sir Thomas Bertram, neglected by Lady Bertram and bullied by her other aunt, the nasty Mrs. Norris. We think surely Crawford is another Darcy. He'll recognize Fanny's true worth and rescue her from poverty and obscurity. And indeed, he does come to recognize her true worth, to love her and to wish to marry her, and offer to rescue her from poverty and obscurity. But is he good enough for Fanny? And can Fanny love him? Even Jane Austen's dearest brother Henry couldn't guess how this novel was going to end when he first read it before publication. Having reached the beginning of volume 2, so about a third of the way through the book, Henry, according to Austen's report to her sister, likes Fanny and I think foresees how it all will be. But no, because a day or two later she adds, he admires Henry Crawford, properly, as a clever, pleasant man. That is, Henry Austen admires his namesake character, Henry Crawford, not as a brilliantly conceived, complex literary creation, but as a person. Yet Henry Crawford, as Austen wrote him into being, is a flawed character, aesthetically attracted to virtue embodied in Fanny, but he lacks the discipline to behave virtuously himself. So by the time Henry Austen reaches the third volume, according to Jane, he has changed his mind as foreseeing the end. He said yesterday, at least, that he defied anybody to say whether Henry Crawford would be reformed or would forget Fanny in a fortnight. It's not surprising that Henry was in suspense. Mansfield Park is the most challenging of Austen's novels, and yet a careful reading of this brilliant novel should leave no reader in doubt as to the relative worth of each character or of the strength of Fanny's integrity. Austen also plays with novel conventions throughout her next novel, Emma, published in 1816. Yeah, 1816, 200 years ago, whose eponymous heroine, Emma Woodhouse, could not be more different than Fanny Price. If Fanny was an anti-Elizabeth Bennet, Emma is an anti-Fanny. Let me read you the brilliant opening paragraphs of the novel. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the two daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint. They had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. And then, if we haven't gotten the point yet, the real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. So that's Emma at the opening of the novel. There we have it. The girl who has everything except a mother seemed to enjoy every blessing, yet the real evils of her situation are complacency and power. She's not threatened by a lack of protectors, false suitors, obscure birth, poverty, or any of the other circumstances that afflict novel heroines. She's threatened by her own lack of self-knowledge, and Austen's going to fix that. Austen famously said that inventing the character of Emma, she was creating, quote, a heroine whom no one but herself would much like, end quote. The challenge for readers is to like Emma in spite of her faults. Austen brilliantly provides foil characters who help us appreciate Emma in spite of her imperfections, so that by the end of the novel we can join what Austen calls the small band of true friends who witness her marriage and rejoice in what she describes as the perfect happiness of the union represented by that marriage. And that's the novel in a nutshell, the perfectibility of Emma Woodhouse as she learns the meaning of true friendship on her way to achieving true love. So I've only talked about 3 of Austen's novels, and only briefly, not too many spoilers, I hope, but I encourage you to discover for yourselves the many pleasures of Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion, as well as Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma, and perhaps even Austen's fragment novels, The Watsons and Sanditon's. You'll have a lot of fun, I promise, and you will almost certainly be a better person for reading them. Thank you.
Well, happy International Women's Day indeed. Thank you, Madame Elaine, for that wonderful and passionate talk, really. Well, we would love to open the floor for questions now, and our IT manager, Jason, will be helping me out with the virtual audience as well. So, any questions? Oh, okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed it. And when I was in high school, we studied Pride and Prejudice. And I've always kept that book, and I refer to it sometimes. Now, my question is, you mentioned that you had these socks, Jane Austen socks. I have a niece who's a writer, and her birthday's coming up. Where can I buy socks like that?
Okay. I think just Google. There are several organizations that sell book-related merch, T-shirts, socks. Oh, I should have said, I'm also wearing the official Jane Austen House Museum reproduction ring because Jane Austen and I share a birthstone.
Any other questions? Oh, I'll be right there.
Yeah. Thank you, Elaine. That was really interesting. Can you talk a bit about the style? I go back to the books, not really for the plots, which I find a bit thin now, but for the language itself, which is a bit dated, but not that much. Yeah. And by the way, did you bid for Colin Firth's shirt? No.
I would take Colin Firth, but I don't need his shirt. That's a good question, because the more you read her contemporaries, other 18th century novelists, the more you read, nobody was writing like Jane Austen. Her style really is, I mean, yes, it's of her time, but it really is unique to her. First of all, everyone else wrote novels with digressions. A novel will stop for 2 chapters while a character tells you the backstory of their life. And she never does that. But yeah, the more you read, the more you see how her use of language and the structure of her narrative is her own. And she really tried to avoid language that would date. So inevitably, it's not quite the way people would write today, but it doesn't feel that old.
maybe my question's sort of similar, but you were talking about her narrative voice and how distinctive it is, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little more. Are you talking about how she puts a different slant on the different characters, or putting her thoughts through them? Just wondered what.
Well, I think one example is that opening of Emma, and in I think also in the first chapter of Emma, where she's discussing the company that Emma can get to come in and stay with her father if she goes out for the evening, and refers to old Mrs. Bates, almost past everything but tea and quadrille, which is a card game, and that's like a line from Alexander Pope. It's the balance of the two elements. Her voice. Gosh, how to first of all, she's often slipping into irony, and she also is, some people would say the first, that's a bit contentious, but a very early practitioner of what later literary scholars called free and direct discourse, which is that the narrative voice slips into the voice, the style, the language of one of the characters without quotation marks and in the third person, so that you have to be very alert as you're reading to say, oh, that's no longer the objective narrator, that's now the narrator assuming the voice of a character. I think there's one exception, and that's her probably the first novel written, but the last to be published, Northanger Abbey, which has a narrator whom I think of as a quixotic narrator. That is, the narrator seems to be at least pretending to expect the heroine to be expressing disappointment that she doesn't live up to that standard, and we don't get that in any other novel. Yeah.
Any other questions? Jason? No?
I've just read a novel recently written by a recent author called P.D. James, who wrote that murder mystery called Death at Pemberley, with the Jane Austen characters, very much in the style of Jane Austen. I mean, you thought you were reading Jane Austen, but this was a real murder mystery, and it was really quite interesting.
Yeah, I was always a big fan of P.D. James mysteries. I love reading detective fiction. That one disappointed me. The bits that I liked were the bits that were kind of a pastiche. They were more or less straight out of Austen, but it didn't merge well with the kind of more lurid, sensational murder plot that Austen would never have touched. Jane Austen's making dramatic material out of social tensions in a village, not out of the drama of a murder mystery that has to be solved, and the mysteries that concern. In Northanger Abbey, the main character is reading Gothic mysteries and loving the suspense of the Gothic mysteries and kind of being a little bit seduced by them. But the real mysteries in Northanger Abbey are why people behave the way they behave. So Austen had a very different project as a writer than James, writing mysteries. It was fun. I didn't find it entirely convincing, but I do like her other novels.
The style sounded very much like
I think she was very deliberately trying to do that and did it pretty well. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll be with you, Madame.
Here you go.
Can you speak about who some of the writers female writers after Jane Austen who were influenced by her writing, her style of writing, her subject matter? Did she have a global impact
Oh,
on English
yes.
literature from in
Oh,
terms
yes.
of female writers?
Oh, yes. I'm trying to remember who it was. I should remember, maybe Judith remembers, who said that Jane Austen had one legitimate offspring, and that was Henry James. There are elements of George Eliot. Gwendolyn Harleth in Daniel Deronda is a kind of, well, I couldn't really say she's a kind of Emma, but there are Emma-like elements to her. A very popular Victorian novelist whom I don't think anyone reads anymore, Margaret Oliphant. Anyone ever read Margaret? They're great, yay! One of her novels is a kind of retelling of both Emma and Persuasion. She kind of merges the plot. But there are whole books written about Jane Austen's descendants in that sense. So, yeah, there are a lot. She changed the novel by moving it from the 18th century marriage plot into an exploration of consciousness.
All right. Well, on behalf of the Atwater Library and Computer Center, and of course our Executive Director, Lynn Verge, who is with us through the power of Zoom, we would like to thank you, Madame Elaine, for sharing your time and expertise. Let's give her a warm applause. Well, just a couple of announcements before we end today's series. First on the list, an exhibition of prints by Mary Yuzan Gigo is here on our top floor mezzanine. Everyone is welcome to visit and enjoy the exhibition right after this. Next would be the bookshop. I see a couple of bookshop volunteers right here, so how could I miss that? Our volunteer-run bookshop is now open Wednesdays to Saturdays from 12 noon to 3 p.m. All kinds of bargain-priced quality books are here, CDs and DVDs as well. And lastly, for next week's lunchtime series, I see you, Madame Catherine, we will be celebrating St. Patrick's Day with Festival Bloomsday Montreal. Of course, they will be presenting a program of Irish music and words. See you all next week and have a fantastic day ahead.